everyone, and welcome to Seed Speaks. This is a video series brought to you by Seed World Group. I'm Mark Zinkowitz, and I'm an editor with Seed World Group. And this month, we're talking about the marketing world of seed and plants. And I'm joined today by four experts. We're going to be talking about something that I love to talk about, and that's beer. I love craft beer. I drink craft beer. I make my own beer. So, needless to say, I really like to yak about the stuff. Today, I'm so happy to have four members of the beer value chain on with me. Dan Simpson is a brewer for Sookram's Brewing in Winnipeg. Aaron Beattie is a barley breeder at the University of Saskatchewan. Doug Monroe is merchandising manager for Boort Malt, also based in Winnipeg. And Peter Watts is director of the Canadian Malting Barley Technical Center in Winnipeg. And me being a beer consumer, that means that we have everyone from along the beer value chain here today. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you. Peter couldn't be on live today. He had a meeting he had to go to, but I was happy to record my chat with him last week, and we're going to play a couple of clips from that. For those who don't know, the Canadian Malting Barley Technical Center evaluates the quality and performance of Canadian malting barley in the malting and brewing process. It's basically a testing facility for malting barley to see how that barley will behave on a commercial scale. And I'm going to actually begin with Peter, who I asked what makes a great malting barley variety. Now, when you listen to this, it's a couple minutes long. Peter's going to reference three major malting barley varieties, and two malting barley varieties, and that's CDC Copeland and AC Metcalf. These are the two biggest malting barley varieties in Canada right now, for those not familiar with the specifics of Canadian malting barley. Here's what Peter had to say.
When we just talk at a very basic level about malting barley quality, the things that are sort of paramount are protein content, germination. You obviously want a high level of germination for the malting process to be effective, and then visual characteristics, staining, free of disease. These types of factors are what a malting company is looking for when they select barley each year. But at a broader level, intrinsically with varieties, malting barley varieties, so these are still important characteristics. You want to have sort of the protein in a certain range, and this is generally environmental, but also can relate to the intrinsic quality of a variety. That some varieties tend to have a slightly higher protein content, like AC Metcalf, slightly lower protein content, like CDC Copeland. And so the newer varieties would also tend to have sort of higher or lower levels of protein content, for example, and associated enzymatic activity. But it's really about consistency of processing for a maltster and a brewer. They want to see a malting barley variety that processes without significant variability, that's consistent, and that's true both in the malt house and in the brewery, so that you're achieving those end use specifications that you're trying to target. And part of the reason that Metcalf, AC Metcalf, and CDC Copeland were such successful varieties was specifically because of their consistency in terms of their processing. They had other important intrinsic characteristics that end users liked. For example, flavor is an important consideration, and or lack of off flavors maybe is a better way to put it. And both AC Metcalf and CDC Copeland seem to have, sort of those mellow flavor characteristics that end users desired. But really, what was paramount and very important was that ease and consistency of processing to achieve those end use specifications, both in the malt house and the brewery.
So, in other words, a quality malting barley variety has a number of characteristics that brewers and maltsters are looking for. I'm going to start with Dan here because Dan makes beer on a commercial scale. I like to make this stuff in my basement, but Dan does it on a much grander level. Now, Sookram's Brewing has 6 flagship beers, including a pale ale, a pilsner, and an imperial stout. Now, Dan, I'm going to pick on you here and ask you, as a brewer, can you tell us in a nutshell, from your perspective, what makes for a high quality malt that you would want to use in your beer?
Yeah, well, I think Peter obviously knows what he's talking about. For us, consistency is everything. So when we're looking for just our base malt to any specialty malt we might choose, you're looking for it to be the same every time so that I don't have to worry about trying to account for those differences.
Now, Doug, you buy malting barley grain, which Boert malt then turns from malting barley into malted barley, which it then sells to brewers around the world. Brewing and malting are two different processes, but they depend on each other. Doug, as a maltster, what do you look for in a malting barley variety?
So there's a couple things. So we're looking for, well, Peter kind of mentioned it in his piece about processing. So with the malt varieties, we want them, when we bring in a malt variety and we malt it as one, like the variety all together, we're not mixing up these different varieties. We want it to process very similar every time. It just cuts down on processing errors. It flows through the plant better. So particularly with Canadian malting barley, it absorbs water well. It usually flows through. The other thing we're looking at is just what our brewing customers want. So that's why there is kind of the few major malting varieties, because they all fit a different spectrum of what a certain brewer would want. Depending on your customer base for your malt company would depend on what type of malt variety that you're buying more of. So if if you have a lot of adjunct customers, you're looking at CDC Fraser, just ones that have higher enzymes for the adjunct brewer. And if you're a craft brewer, you're looking at Copeland, maybe Synergy. Just because they have lower protein, lower enzymes, it just works better for that brewer.
Now, you mentioned synergy there, and that's another one of the big dominant malting barley varieties in Canada, along with Copeland and Metcalfe. Now, Aaron, you're a guy who actually breeds malting barley. You are one of Canada's best known malting barley breeders. I can't imagine what a challenge it is for you to try and meet the needs of both the malting and brewing industries. In a nutshell, Aaron, how are you working to meet the demands of guys like Dan and Doug? I mean, I know that's such a broad question, but can you kind of give us a synopsis of kind of your workflow and what you do to try and satisfy these end use characteristics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the brewers and maltsters as sort of, different entities, and obviously they are, but, those two groups, at least from a breeder's point of view, are probably, we sort of put them into the same bucket. It's probably more challenging to sort of deal with the needs of maltsters, brewers versus farmers. I think those two groups would be a little bit more opposed in terms of, things that they're interested in. But in terms of what we are trying to do for the maltster brewer, this idea of consistency is important. So, from our point of view, we're looking at varieties that are able to be grown across a wide geography in Western Canada. One of the keys to having consistency and one of the big advantages Canada or Western Canada has is that we have a relatively small number of these malting barley varieties that are grown, and we basically overproduce what we typically need in a given year. So that gives the maltsters some ability to be a little bit pickier and sort of hit the specs they need, which makes their processing a little bit easier, and then ultimately, onto the customers like Dan in terms of what they're looking for. So as a breeder, if we can get those varieties growing across Western Canada that farmers are happy with, that just gives us a bigger pool of barley to select from overall. But specifically, Doug mentioned this idea that we have these sort of two different categories of malting barley, which have in the past been represented by Copeland and Metcalfe, and now maybe be more represented by Fraser Synergy. We've sort of, as a breeder, I'm aiming for, either very high enzymatic levels or very low ones. So that's sort of the Metcalfe Copeland difference there. But to go along with that, we're looking at keeping those beta glucan levels down, which goes to that easy processing, both as a brewer and a maltster. Maintaining some higher extract levels. So depending on the volume of your brewery, that becomes more or less important as a characteristic. So, those are big picture things. The flavor piece comes into it a little bit, and I think Peter kind of put it well. There is a lot of talk about flavor from the point of view of what the actual barley can contribute. We tend to think of it as sort of providing, almost like a neutral palate that the maltster and then ultimately the brewer can build upon. So we're really mostly aiming for not having off flavors that are detectable, and let everyone else do their work and create those interesting flavors that come through in the beer.
Now, Aaron, you hit on something important, and that's the fact that there's all these different varieties in the marketplace. There's these older varieties that have dominated, like Metcalfe and Copeland and Synergy. And then there's newer varieties that are just kind of coming up in the ranks. And this is something I run into over and over again as I write about this topic, is the need for newer varieties to come along and gradually replace those older varieties, just like with any other crop. The most popular malting barley variety in Canada right now is CDC Copeland, and that was bred quite a few years ago, actually, at your university, Aaron. And coming in second is AAC Synergy, also an older variety. Then there's AC Metcalfe, another older variety that still has a lot of acres. But there are some new varieties gaining ground, like I say, including AAC Connect. And then one of your varieties, Aaron, CDC Fraser, which is becoming more popular. I asked Peter how we can transition from older varieties to newer ones. Let's see what he had to say.
We need the new genetics with the better yields, the better disease packages, the better lodging resistance. I mean, lodging is a big issue for barley, so the newer varieties tend to have better standability than the old varieties, significantly better. I mean, that's a huge issue for producers. If the barley falls down, then doesn't matter if it's going to feed, but for the malting industry, you don't want the barley lying on the ground, getting wet, getting stained, losing germination. So we need those new varieties to stay competitive. We know that crops like wheat and canola are increasing their yields over time, as is barley, but not as quickly. And Canada is expensive in the international market. Canadian barley is expensive. So in order to ensure that it's a competitive crop, both for producers and also as a product for our export customers, having the better yielding, better disease package varieties is critical to the success of the industry in the long term.
Now, Peter makes a great point there, and that's, whenever you're transitioning to a newer variety, you have to be careful. I mean, guys like you, Dan, you want barley varieties that are going to make good beer. Doug, you need varieties that are going to make good malt. Aaron, you're working to meet those end use characteristics. So you're selecting the best of the best that you want to introduce as those new varieties that could potentially be the next big malting barley varieties. Dan, I'm going to turn over to you again. And, beer lovers like me, Dan, we tend to talk a lot about hops and how they affect beer. These hops create a certain aroma. These ones contribute to bitterness. These ones have a really great flavor. So hops are really big in the craft beer world, as you well know, but we don't often think about barley varieties and how they impact beer in terms of flavor and other things. Now, we've got these three varieties in the market now: Copeland, Synergy, and Metcalf, these really big popular ones. Fraser and Connect are starting to gain some ground. Dan, for you as a brewer, how do different varieties of malt affect beer, whether it's the body or the flavor or the alcohol content? In your experience, Dan, as a brewer, how does one malting barley variety kind of stack up against another one in your experience?
Well, in my, I guess, limited experience, I mean, I'm guilty of the same thing. Coming out of home brewing, being very focused on hops and excited about hops and growing my own hops and using hops, and so I'm very much at the beginning of the learning curve of what really goes into malting barley. So as an end user, I don't really know what varieties of barley are coming in through my malts. I'm just looking for that usability and consistency. So when we have growing years like we had a couple of years ago that really stress out the malt, all of a sudden I see process issues. The malt gets a lot stickier. There's a lot more protein. And so then I need to find solutions in order to try and keep our products as consistent as possible and be able to louder the grain properly and get as much efficiency as I can out.
That's interesting. So you don't actually choose the variety that you use then, Dan. You're not like, oh, well, for this beer, I want Copeland. For this beer, I want Synergy. That's obviously not how the process works. You're using kinds of certain types of malting barley varieties that you are essentially given by the malting industry. So that's essentially what's happening when you go to brew a beer, right? It's like you're kind of working with what you have as opposed to saying, well, I want a certain type of malt for this, right?
Yes, in our case, we're trusting the maltster to be doing all of that end of it, and they're selling us a finished malt that meets certain specifications. And for the most part, it's never been something I've had to worry too much about, and that changed recently with some stressed out crops in the last couple of years. So now I'm really starting to learn how all these things affect each other, and so I'm going down that rabbit hole now, and it's a pretty interesting world.
Ah, so you're trusting guys like Doug to do a really good job and give you really good malt. No pressure, Doug.
Mhm.
But I'm curious, Doug, like it's your company's job to sell malt to guys like Dan, right? And I imagine that takes some work on your part, that you've got to come up with malting blends that you know are going to do a good job for, say, a craft brewer, and then probably a different blend that you know is going to satisfy the big guys like Anheuser-Busch who are making these big mass-produced beers. So, Doug, you must have days where you talk to someone like Dan maybe and say, hey, we're thinking of trying such and such a malt. This might serve you well. How do you even begin to try and introduce a new malt that brewers maybe haven't used before in the past? How does that work?
Okay, so just to clarify, depending on what type of brewer you are and the size of your brewer, many brewers ask for specific varieties. So in their malt specification, they will lay out what varieties you can use. So that's kind of the starting point. There is what we call generic two-row malt, which would have the two rows that are grown in Canada and various portions in that malt. It's not variety specific. It's more on the analysis specific. But for the brewer that does have specific varieties, and they might cap the amount of variety in their malt blend. So to get them to change to a new one sometimes isn't easy because they have a product, they're using specific varieties, has a certain flavor profile. It might go through their brew house fairly efficiently. So to get them to change, you have to show them that new variety has the same qualities as one of the older ones. Maybe it's even slightly better. And also there's the counterpoint of that is most brewers want to know how it's performing in the field for the farmer. If the yields, there's always the economics of it too. If you get a new variety and people like it, but the yield is substantially better than the older variety, there's that economics. Maybe the brewer will get, the variety, or the price might drop just due to the increased yield in the field. So to start that path, it's kind of time consuming because you malt individual varieties, you package them, send them to the brewers who are interested, and they're going to pilot brew with it, do flavor tests on it. Then they might get to if they like it, they might get to the next stage where they'll put it in their malt blend and move it forward through the system. So it's not a quick system. And also getting a new variety and ramping up enough for different brewers to have the volume to use to do these tests is sometimes time consuming. So it can, after a variety is registered, it can take 3, 4, 5 years before what we call the variety as being commercially acceptable. So then you have brewers brewing with that variety on a commercial level and it's in the market. So it's time consuming, and you need a partner with a brewer who wants to do that work, because for them too, doing all these tests is also, costs money for us, costs money for everybody. But in the long run, it's to an advantage to everybody.
I imagine, Aaron, you're probably sitting there holding your tongue a little bit, because I know how hard a job it is to be a plant breeder and to make people like Dan and Doug happy. You don't have that magic wand to just make this perfect variety that fulfills every single end use. I mean, that's not how breeding works. But this is your chance to enlighten us. No plant breeder, like I say, can wave that magic wand and create the perfect variety. So can you tell us, what are the big challenges, Aaron, that you face right now in breeding, and how are you working to deal with those?
Yeah, actually, I know we have obviously are focused a little bit more here on the sort of the end use side of the picture, but from my point of view, probably the biggest challenges are coming from the other side of the table, which is the production side. Before it even gets to a maltster, it's got to hit certain specs related to things like germination and lack of pre-harvest sprouting and disease, or lack or absence of disease. And so, right now it's not a new topic, but fusarium continues to be sort of a real high priority target for us, and it's still one of the biggest challenges we have to produce varieties that are moving more towards that moderately resistant end of the spectrum there. The variety itself is never going to be the solution to fusarium, but it's part of the picture. And so for us, that's a big one that we continue to focus on a lot, so that there is more barley to select from out there. Peter mentioned lodging, and that's something we've been working on the last probably 4 years. We've had a project with collaboration with the National Research Council here in Saskatoon, where we've been looking at what are those factors that lead to better or worse lodging in a barley variety. And we've been focusing a lot on the architecture of the root system in the plant. And there's been some interesting findings there that I think are going to help breeders do a better job to continue to produce varieties in the future that are improvements over things like Fraser and Connect, which are improvements themselves over Copeland and Metcalf. So lodging's a big one. And then probably just dealing with things like, those environmental stresses. So, salinity is a big one that we deal with here in Western Canada. As we get into drier cycles within our growing seasons, that just exacerbates the salinity issue. And barley is known to be a little bit more saline tolerant than some of the other cereals, which means it gets put into those parts of growers' fields which tend to be a little more saline. So barley, it's an important thing for us to try to improve that ability for the crop to tolerate those kinds of stresses. So we've just embarked on a project to look at variation within the barley germplasm, within breeding lines, to help us maybe improve that angle on things. So for us, we have a pretty good sense of what the maltsters and brewers are looking for. Certainly, we continue to work on that, but the big challenges are probably on the production end of things, because as everyone's kind of mentioned, you have to keep barley as a viable option for growers out there, and that does mean transitioning varieties so that yield potential is there for them.
Now, before we sign off for the day, I have a couple audience members. Cosmin Badia mentioned, I said that CDC Fraser and AC Connect were gaining ground. He mentioned that AC Connect is actually at 10% now. So thanks for that, Cosmin. So yeah, these newer varieties are, I should say, more than gaining ground. They are becoming quite popular, and several of them look like they will be the next probably big varieties in the malting world. So thank you, Cosmin. And we have an audience question regarding fusarium. What impact do diseases like fusarium have on barley when it comes to malting? Is clean grain important for malting? And I'm thinking, Aaron and Doug, you could probably enlighten us there in terms of a disease like fusarium. Aaron, is that something that is of big concern to you?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll just, I mean, as I mentioned just now, fusarium is sort of our number one disease we worry about, and it primarily has to do, I mean, there are some impacts on the physical appearance or characteristics of the grain, but primarily it's the Dawn mycotoxin that's the big killer when it comes to fusarium, and it's the limits on how much is taken or how much contamination of Dawn there can be in the grain is very low, and it's a make it or break it characteristic for a farmer trying to sell it into either a grain handling facility or to a maltster.
Yeah, Doug, you kind of chuckled there for a second,
Yeah.
Doug. So I'm thinking that you probably agree with Aaron that it's
Yeah,
a big concern.
as Aaron's mentioned, it's every year you hope that you don't, we haven't had a fairly substantial fusarium year for a couple, but you never know. Around the corner it could be this year, and just because of the toxin, you're looking through a lot of barley that has fusarium, and you can't, because it's a toxin, you can't use it. It also, you're looking at the feed market, all the end uses for it are hurt. So it is a serious problem. Depending on the crop year, it's a large problem. That's what, I'll be honest, lots of money in probably the last 2 decades have been spent on breeding for fusarium resistance. And we got to keep going, because, it's in the food chain, corn, it's in all the cereals. So it's huge.
Dan, I'll give you the last word before we sign off. Is there one problem you have sometimes with malt, or a flaw, something that, a criticism you have sometimes with your malt that you'd love to see guys like Doug or Aaron solve for you? Is there one thing that you can think of?
Yeah, perfection every time, please. No, I mean, we contract through CMG, which is a company that grows mostly in Alberta. And aside from these recent crops being harder to lauter, kind of stickier grain, and having to come up with solutions for that, we're very happy with the consistency that we're able to get in terms of flavors. We're a very small brewery. We don't have much budget or time for research or flavor tests or all of this. So we count on the industry around us to sort of sort all that out. And these things kind of happen to us, and we get the high level reports. And as I said, I'm just starting to learn about all that goes into me getting good quality malt. So I'd just say, keep up the good work.
Well, there you go, Aaron and Doug. You heard it right from the source. You guys are doing a great job for the brewers. So keep up the good work. And thanks, everybody, for being on Seed Speaks today. It was great to chat with you guys. And thanks to our audience for spending part of your lunch hour with us. We really appreciate it. Thanks again to Peter Watts for talking to me last week. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. You can join us on Seed Speaks again next week when Ashley Robinson tackles the topic of breeding ornamentals. This is Mark Zinkowitz signing off. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks.